Picture a kitchen built to feed an army, and then picture that army arriving 19 days early, with an appetite that never once slows down. Now understand that you are the one who has to keep filling the pots. Before the Queen has even set foot past the gatehouse, you already know this feast is going to break something. You just don't know yet whether it will be the ovens, the Earl's fortune, or you. You're 14 years old, and 3 days ago you were pulling barley out of a field with your father, watching the sky for rain, worrying about the same things every tenant family near Kenilworth worries about in the second week of July. Then a man in the Earl of Leicester's livery rode into the village with a list in his hand, and your name was on it, and that was that. Not a request, a summons. The great households of England do not ask. Your mother cried a little when the man read out the terms. Not because you were leaving. Girls leave for service all the time, that's not a tragedy, that's just life. But because of the timing. Harvest is close. Every pair of hands in the parish is needed in the fields, and here is the Earl's officer telling your father that his daughter is wanted in the castle kitchens for the Queen's visit, for as long as the Queen chooses to stay, and there will be no arguing about it, and precious little payment for the privilege. How long is she staying? Your father asked. The officer shrugged. However long Her Majesty pleases. Could be a week, could be a month. The Earl doesn't set the Queen's calendar, and neither do I. It turned into 19 days. You didn't know that yet, standing in your own dooryard with your apron already folded under your arm because your mother had pressed it on you before you'd even said yes. 19 days is a long time to be gone from a farm in July. It is the difference between a harvest brought in and a harvest half lost, between a winter with enough and a winter without. Nobody asked your family whether they could spare you. That's not how a royal progress works. When the Queen decides to visit a nobleman's house, the nobleman's need becomes everyone's need for as far as his authority reaches, and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, reaches a long way. His men had been riding through every village within 10 miles of Kenilworth for weeks, and not just for girls like you. They'd been taking food too. Purveyance, it's called, and it is one of the oldest, least loved words in the English countryside. Here is what purveyance means, in case nobody has ever explained it to you plainly. When the Crown or a great household needs supplies for a royal visit, its officers can requisition them from the surrounding country at prices the officers themselves decide, not market prices. Whatever the Crown's book says a chicken or a side of bacon is worth, which by July of 1575 has borne almost no relationship to what a chicken or a side of bacon actually costs for a decade or more. Farmers grumble about it every single year the court goes on progress, and every single year it happens anyway, because grumbling has never yet stopped a purveyor's cart. Your own father lost 2 of his best hens to a purveyance order 11 days before you were summoned yourself, paid for at a price that wouldn't buy him a single one back at market. He didn't complain where the officer could hear him. Nobody does. You learn early in a farming family exactly how much power sits on the other side of a request like that, and exactly how little good it does to refuse it. So you walk to Kenilworth Castle with your bundle of spare linen and your mother's wooden comb, and a heart that felt like it was trying to climb up out of your chest, because you had never in your life seen a building like the one that was about to swallow you whole for the better part of 3 weeks. You'd seen the castle before from a distance, the way everyone in the village had seen it, a grey shape on the horizon, towers and battlements from an older, harder century, sitting behind its long lake like something out of a ballad. What you hadn't seen, because nobody outside the walls had been allowed to see it yet, was what the Earl had built onto it that spring and summer. A whole new range of lodgings and a banqueting hall so large it needed its own foundations. Glass in every window. Real glass. More glass in that one building than in your entire parish. Put up in a matter of months by hundreds of masons and carpenters, working from before dawn until the light failed. Because the Earl of Leicester had exactly one chance to impress the Queen of England into finally, after all these years, marrying him. And he was not going to let a shortage of window glass be the reason it didn't work. You didn't know any of that yet on the road. You just knew your feet hurt and your bundle was heavy, and the gatehouse ahead of you looked like the mouth of something that was going to eat you and not particularly care whether you agreed to it. The steward who met the new kitchen girls at the base court didn't waste time on kindness. He had a list too, longer than the one the officer had carried to your village, and he read names off it in a flat, fast voice while a clerk beside him made marks in a ledger. Sadler, Nell Sadler. Here, you said, and your voice came out smaller than you meant it to. He looked at you exactly as long as it took to confirm you had 2 arms and 2 legs, and appeared capable of standing upright for extended periods, then jerked his head toward an archway and moved on to the next name. That was the whole of your welcome to the greatest household feast England had seen in living memory. A glance, a jerk of the head. Get moving. You got moving. Before you'd even reached that archway, crossing the base court itself with your bundle knocking against your hip, you'd passed enough strangeness to fill a whole year's worth of village gossip. Carpenters still up on scaffolding against the new banqueting range, hammers going in a ragged, uneven rhythm that never quite stopped. A cart piled with nothing but candles, hundreds of them, tallow and beeswax both, more candles in that single cart than your parish church burned through in a decade. 2 men wrestling a length of painted canvas taller than either of them, through a doorway too narrow for it, cursing at each other in a language you didn't recognize. A boy your own age leading a string of horses so fine, so glossy-coated and clean-legged, that you understood without anyone telling you that they belonged to somebody who had never once in his life mucked out a stable himself. The ground under your feet had been freshly gravelled, still loose in places, crunching and shifting underfoot in a way the packed dirt of your own village lanes never did. The air smelled of sawdust and fresh paint and horse dung, and underneath all of it, faint but unmistakable even from the base court, wood smoke on a scale you hadn't smelled before. Not 1 hearth's worth, not even a dozen, but something closer to a whole village's chimneys, all lit at once, and channeled into a single sprawling complex of ovens and hearths just beyond the walls ahead of you. The passage under the archway was cool and dim after the glare of the base court. Stone walls sweating faintly with the damp that never quite leaves old buildings even in July, and then it opened out into a yard behind the kitchens and the noise hit you like a wall of water. You had never heard anything like it. Not market day, not the parish fair, not even the noise of the whole village turned out for a barn raising. This was 100 conversations shouted over each other. The ring of metal on metal from somewhere you couldn't see. The shriek of a pig somewhere close that you understood, with a lurch in your stomach, was not going to shriek very much longer. The crack and hiss of fires already burning in ovens built into the yard's outer wall, axles groaning under the weight of carts still arriving, though the household had been provisioning for this visit for weeks already, and you would have thought by now every road for 10 miles must be picked clean. It wasn't picked clean. It would not be picked clean for another 19 days. That was the first thing Kenilworth taught you, standing in that yard with your bundle clutched against your chest, and nobody paying you the slightest attention, that you had underestimated by an order of magnitude you did not yet have the arithmetic to describe, exactly how much a great household can eat. A woman found you before you'd worked out where to put your feet. Broad through the shoulders, forearms scarred pale in places where hot fat had found her more than once, sleeves shoved up past her elbows though it wasn't yet 6 in the morning. She had the look of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything roughly a decade ago. New, she said, though it wasn't really a question, since nobody who belonged here would be standing in the middle of the yard gawping like you were. Yes, Nell Sadler from the village. Right, I'm Joan. You're on the spits with me and the boys until someone tells us otherwise, which nobody will, because nobody up in that hall is thinking about the spits at all. Come on, don't stand still in a working kitchen, girl, you'll get run down. She was not exaggerating. Within 10 steps you had nearly been knocked flat by a boy hauling a yoke with 2 full buckets, and a moment after that a man went past at something close to a run, with a whole side of a deer balanced across his shoulders, and behind him another with a basket of eels still twisting against each other, silver black and slick, water sloshing over the rim with every stride. The kitchen itself, when Joan finally hauled you into it, was not one room but a whole run of them. The great kitchen with its enormous hearths, each one big enough to roast an ox whole, which as it turned out was not a figure of speech, because there was in fact an ox being roasted whole in one of them that very morning. The pastry house, thick with flour dust hanging in the light from the high windows like fog. The boiling house where the coppers were already going, steam pouring off them thick enough to soak your hair in minutes. The bakehouse, where the ovens had been lit before midnight and would not go cold again, Joan told you, not once, not for 19 days, because bread does not wait for anybody, and neither does an army of guests. How many? You asked her, meaning how many guests, how many mouths, and she laughed, not unkindly, just the laugh of someone who had heard the question 100 times already that week. Nobody's counted exact and nobody's going to. The Queen brings her whole court, that's her ladies and her gentlemen and her guard and half of London's fine society trailing along behind because everyone wants to be seen at Kenilworth this summer. Then there's the Earl's own household, which is not small to begin with. Then there's the servants of every one of those guests, because a lord doesn't travel without his own men, does he? Then there's us. Then there's every carpenter and mason still finishing off the new buildings, because between you and me, girl, they were still hanging doors the morning she rode in. You want a number, I'll give you one. More than 1,000 souls need feeding here, every single day, 3 times a day, and some of them expect it done up finer than anything they'd get at their own tables at home. That's your number. Now get over to the spit before that goose burns, because burnt goose is coming out of somebody's wages and it is not going to be mine. You got over to the spit. The spit itself was a length of iron as long as you were tall, driven through the body of a goose already dressed and trussed, resting in cradles over a bed of coals that threw heat at your face and arms, even from 3 feet away. Your job, the job of every spit-turner in that kitchen, and there were a great many of you, boys mostly, a few girls, all of you sweating and squinting against the glare, was to keep the handle turning, slowly, steadily, hour after hour, not too fast, or the outside burns before the inside cooks, not too slow, or the same thing happens from the other direction, the fat pooling and scorching on one side while the rest stays raw. Nobody explains the rhythm to you in words. Joan showed you with her own hand on the handle for the first several turns, a steady count under her breath, And then she put your hand where hers had been and stepped back to watch. And that was your entire education in the trade you would be practicing, more or less without a break, for the rest of the day. Your palm found the wood of the handle warm already from her grip, smooth in places from years of other hands doing exactly what yours was doing now, splintered in one spot that you learned within the hour to angle your fingers around. The heat came off the coals in waves you could feel against your shins, even through your skirts, a dry heat that made the small hairs on your arms curl and the sweat run down your spine before you'd done 20 turns. The smell filled your whole head. Goose fat spitting and dripping into the pan below, catching sometimes with a hiss and a curl of sharper smoke. The sweetness of it turning your stomach in a way you hadn't expected, because you'd eaten almost nothing since before dawn, and the smell of good food cooking on an empty stomach is its own particular kind of torment. Your arm ached within the first half hour, not the sharp ache of a single hard effort, but the low, grinding ache of a small motion repeated without end. The kind that starts in your shoulder and works its way down into your wrist and settles there like it plans to stay. By midday your palm had gone red and tender where the wood pressed against it, and by evening it had started to blister, and Joan looked at the blister when she checked on you and only said, "Wrap it in a rag and keep turning. You'll have a callus in a week and you won't feel a thing after that." Which was true, and also not remotely the comfort she seemed to think it was. The heat never let up. That was the thing nobody had told you about kitchen work at this scale. The thing you understood in your body long before you understood it in words. It was July, and the great kitchen at Kenilworth had perhaps a dozen fires going at once, in a space that was already warm from the summer pressing in through every gap in the walls, and there was no getting away from it, not for a moment, not even at the far end of the room where you thought the air might be cooler, and discovered instead that it had simply picked up smoke instead of losing heat. Your dress stuck to your back within the hour. Sweat ran down behind your knees and pooled in the creases of your elbows. The women around you had long since stopped bothering to wipe their faces, because there was no point. The sweat came back faster than any rag could clear it, and you learned to stop bothering too, though it took you the better part of the first day to stop minding how you must have looked. By the time the goose came off the spit, done, finally, skin gone dark gold and crackling, fat pooled thick and amber in the pan beneath. Your arm was shaking too badly to hold a ladle steady, and someone else's hands took the bird away to be dressed for the hall, and someone else's hands put a fresh one, plucked and trussed and dripping, onto your spit, and you started again. You met the boy on the next spit over some time in that first long afternoon, though met is a generous word for two people too exhausted to do more than trade names between turns of the handle. His name was Davy, and he was younger than you, maybe 11, with the particular thinness of a boy who has been fed enough to survive but not enough to fill out, and he had been working the spit since before the masons finished the new banqueting hall, which meant he knew things you didn't. "They'll want 6 courses tonight," he told you, not looking up from his own goose. "Maybe more. Now the Queen's actually here. First few nights are always worst. Everybody wants to show off before they settle into it." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've done 3 progresses now. This one's the biggest by a mile, though. My uncle's a carter, brings in game from 3 parishes over, and he says he's never seen an order like the Earl's put in this summer. Deer by the score, sheep you couldn't count. Beer." He whistled through the gap where a tooth used to be. "Ask Joan about the beer sometime. She'll tell you a number and you won't believe her." You asked Joan about the beer, later, when the second goose was resting easier on its spit, and your arm had found something like a rhythm it could sustain without your whole attention on it. 300 and something hogsheads, Joan said, not even pausing in what she was doing, which at that moment was gutting a brace of rabbits with a speed and lack of ceremony that made your own stomach turn slightly. Might be more by now, might be less the way this lot drinks. A hogshead's near enough 60 gallons, if that means anything to a farm girl. It did mean something to a farm girl, or it meant enough. Your father's whole household in a good year might get through a fraction of a single hogshead across a full month, and here was a number that made the beer alone, just the beer, sound less like household drink and more like a small lake. Somebody meant to empty into several thousand human bodies over the course of 3 weeks. Where does it all come from, you asked, though part of you already suspected the answer, because you had watched your own father's hens carried off 11 days before. Where do you think? Joan said, and didn't elaborate because she didn't need to. Every scrap of flour in the bakehouse, every ox and sheep and deer roasting in the great hearths, every barrel of beer and every capon and every basket of eels, all of it had come from somewhere within a day or two's cart ride of Kenilworth, requisitioned at the Earl's price and not the seller's, because that is what it means when the greatest household in the county throws a feast for the greatest person in the realm. The county pays for it, whether the county can spare the price or not. You thought about your father's 2 hens. 2 hens against 300 hogsheads of beer and a whole roasted ox and however many hundreds of deer had gone into the venison pasties you could smell baking 2 rooms away. It didn't seem like very much set against a number that size. It hadn't felt small at all, standing in your own dooryard watching him hand them over. That was the shape of the whole feast you would come to understand over the following days if you stood back far enough to see it clearly, which nobody in that kitchen ever had time to do, because standing back far enough to see anything clearly was a luxury for people who did not have to keep a spit turning. Above, in the hall and the gardens and the specially dug arena for the bear baiting, there was more food and wine and spectacle than most of the guests would see again in their lives, poured out with a lavishness that was the entire point, because the entire point of the visit was to dazzle the Queen into a decision the Earl had been trying to win from her for the better part of 15 years. Below, in the kitchens and the yards and the villages for 10 miles around, there was a great deal of exhausted, undernourished, occasionally furious labour holding the whole spectacle up, and precious little of the wine or the venison pasty ever made its way down to where the labour was. You didn't get to eat well that first day, despite standing over roasting geese for 12 hours straight with a stomach that ached from hunger by noon. What you got when Joan finally called a halt to let the spit-turners eat something themselves was bread. Good bread, at least. Better than what your mother baked at home, because the bakehouse turned out finer loaves for the household, even at the bottom of the servants' table, than most farm kitchens ever saw, and a heel of hard cheese, and a cup of small beer that tasted faintly of the barrel it had travelled in. That's it, you said, before you could stop yourself looking at the mountain of meat all around you. More meat in that one kitchen than your whole village would eat in a season. Joan gave you a look that wasn't unkind exactly, but had no patience in it either. That's it. None of what's on those spits is for the likes of us, girl, and you'd best get that clear in your head now, because you'll be staring at roast meat for the better part of 3 weeks, and it is not going to become yours no matter how long you stare. What the hall doesn't finish comes back down eventually, some of it, when the stewards decide, and there'll be a feast for the servants at the end if the Earl's in a generous mood, which he usually is once the Queen's safely gone, and he can breathe again. Until then, you eat what's put in front of you, and you keep that spit turning. because the goose doesn't care that you're hungry, and neither does anyone else in this castle. You ate your bread and cheese standing up, leaning against the warm stone by the hearth, because there was nowhere to sit and no time to sit in, even if there had been. And you watched a boy no older than Davy stagger past under the weight of a basket of oranges. Oranges in July in Warwickshire. Fruit you had never once seen in your life outside a merchant's cart pass through the village on its way to somewhere grander. And you understood, in the particular way your body understands things before your mind catches up to them, exactly how far apart the world above you and the world you were standing in really were, though they were separated by nothing more than a single flight of stairs. The Queen arrived on the 9th day of July in the evening, and even from inside the kitchen you knew the exact moment it happened, because the whole castle seemed to draw one enormous breath and hold it. Jones sent you out with a message for the buttery, an excuse you understood later, dressed up as an errand, because she had seen how pale and shaking you'd gone after 6 straight hours at the spit and decided you needed 10 minutes, where nobody could see your hands not steady. And your path took you close enough to the outer walls that you could hear it. Trumpets first, thin and bright over the noise of the crowd. Then the crowd itself, a roar that didn't sound like anything you'd ever heard a crowd make. Not fair day noise, not market noise. Something with more awe folded into it. You climbed onto an overturned barrel by the buttery door just for a moment, just long enough to see over the wall into the base court. And what you saw stopped the breath in your own chest along with everyone else's. The lake, the mere, they called it, the long artificial water that ran along one whole side of the castle, had a floating island on it that hadn't been there that morning. Torches burned along its edge, though the light hadn't properly failed yet, and a woman stood on it dressed as something out of an old story, robes trailing into the water, and even at that distance and over that much noise you could hear her voice carrying, high and clear and rehearsed within an inch of its life, welcoming the Queen of England to Kenilworth in the character of the Lady of the Lake, guardian of these waters since the days of King Arthur, waiting, the story went, for a monarch great enough to be worth revealing herself to. Beside the island, cutting through the water on some kind of hidden mechanism that made him seem to glide rather than swim, came a man dressed as the sea god Arion, mounted on the painted back of an enormous dolphin, and inside the dolphin you would learn days later from Davy, who heard it from a groom, who heard it from one of the Italian craftsmen who'd built the thing, was a musician who was meant to sing as the dolphin approached the shore, and who had, in fact, been so seasick from being shut inside a rocking painted fish for the better part of an hour that when the moment came for him to sing he could barely manage it, and broke character entirely, and called out to the Queen in his own voice that he was not really Arion at all, only poor Harry Goldingham, and if it pleased her he would rather be himself than a Greek god who made a man's stomach turn inside out. And the story went that the Queen laughed harder at that than at anything else in the whole elaborate performance, which had cost weeks of some very serious men's very serious planning to arrange. You didn't see any of that part. You only saw the torches and the floating island, and the strange painted dolphin gliding across dark water in the last of the evening light, heard the far-off cheer that went up as the Queen's own barge drew close to the shore, and then Joan's voice cutting through everything, calling you back to the kitchen because 10 minutes of watching the world above you was already 9 minutes more than you'd been given leave to take. That night, after full dark had fallen, the fireworks began. You were back on the spit by then, arm aching in its familiar way, when the first great crack sounded from somewhere out past the mere, so loud and so sudden that half the kitchen jumped, and one of the scullery boys dropped an entire tray of pastry shells onto the floor. Then another crack, and another, close enough together that they started to blur into a single continuous roar, and light strobed in through the high windows of the kitchen in colours. Actual colours, not just the orange of fire, but green and something like blue, that none of you had ever seen fire make before. "Italians," Joan said, not stopping her work, though even she glanced up once when a particularly enormous crack made the whole building seem to shudder. "The Earl brought in men from Italy just for this. Cost more than most men see in a lifetime, that display alone. So somebody told me. They say it can be heard 20 miles off. They say windows have cracked from it in villages nowhere near here. You thought of your own family's windows, such as they were, mostly shuttered wood rather than glass, 20 miles or more to the south, and wondered if your mother was standing in the dooryard right now, looking north at a sky that must have been lit up like the end of the world, wondering what in God's name they were doing to the sky over Kenilworth. The fireworks went on for the better part of an hour. You couldn't see them from the kitchen, only the light of them flaring against the windows and the walls. But you could feel each explosion in your chest the way you might feel thunder that was somehow also underfoot, and underneath the spectacle of it, working the spit with your blistered palm wrapped in a strip of rag, you felt something else too. Something it took you longer to name, a low, persistent unease at exactly how close all of that fire and gunpowder was sitting to a castle built mostly of wood and thatch and dry summer timber, in the middle of the driest stretch of a July that hadn't seen decent rain in nearly 3 weeks. Nobody else in the kitchen seemed to share the worry, or if they did, they'd long since decided it wasn't their place to voice it. The Italian craftsmen knew their business, presumably. The Earl's own men had surely thought of the risk. You were 14 years old and had been in this castle for less than a single day, and it was not your place to say anything at all. You said nothing. You kept turning the spit, and the fire in the sky kept cracking and blooming in colours no one in your village would have believed if you told them, and somewhere in the back of your mind, without your quite deciding to put it there, a small cold thought settled in and stayed, that a place holding this much fire, this close together, for this many days running, was a place that was tempting something, whether anyone above the kitchens wanted to admit it or not. By the 3rd day, your hands had stopped being your own hands and become instead a pair of tools that happened to be attached to your arms. The blister on your right palm had broken and reformed and broken again, and Joan had been right about the callus starting, a hard shiny patch where the skin had simply given up trying to heal properly and decided to toughen instead. Your shoulders ached in a way that had stopped being pain exactly, and become something closer to a permanent weight, settled in and unmoving, the kind of ache you carried up the ladder to the loft, where the kitchen girls slept and carried back down again before dawn because sleep did not undo it, not in the handful of hours you were given for sleeping. You slept, when you slept, in a loft above the bakehouse with 11 other girls, packed close on pallets of straw that smelled permanently of flour dust and wood smoke. And even there the heat from the ovens below rose up through the floorboards and kept the whole room warmer than any July night had a right to be. You learned to sleep in the noise of the ovens being fed at 3 in the morning, learned to sleep through the particular clatter of the first bread trays going in before the sky outside had even begun to grey. Because if you didn't learn to sleep through it, you simply wouldn't sleep at all, and a body cannot run 12, 14, Sometimes 18 hours of kitchen work on no sleep at all, not for 19 days running, not without breaking somewhere. You met the Italian on the 4th day, though you didn't know at first that was what he was. He came through the kitchen yard in the early afternoon with 2 of his own men, dark-eyed, quick-spoken in a language you didn't recognize, carrying wooden cases packed with straw that he handled the way your father handled a basket of eggs. Carefully, both hands, feet placed with obvious deliberation on the uneven cobbles. Mind those, Joan warned you before you'd even asked. That's the firework master and his men. What's in those boxes will take your hand off if you drop it wrong, so give him room. You gave him room. He passed close enough that you caught the smell of him, sulphur and something sharper underneath it, a smell that clung to his clothes the way wood smoke clung to yours, and you understood, watching him set the crates down with the same slow care he'd carried them with, that this was a man who thought about fire differently than anyone else in the castle. Not as a tool to be fed and banked and used, the way the kitchen thought about it, but as something closer to a wild animal he had learned to work with, and never, ever stopped respecting. Later that same afternoon, while you were resting your arm for the 10 minutes Joan allowed between spits, you watched him and his men laying lines of something dark along the ground near the mere, working with a focus so total that they didn't seem to notice the crowd of servants who'd gathered at a careful distance to watch. One of his own men, younger than the master, maybe 18, with a burn scar running pale and shiny down the back of one hand, caught you watching and grinned, not unkindly. "You work the kitchen?" he asked, in English rough enough that you understood he'd learned it recently and mostly by necessity. "Spits, since the Queen came." He nodded at that, glanced back at the lines his master was laying with such care. "Fire is fire," he said, like it was a lesson he'd been taught and was passing along because he thought you should have it too. Big fire, small fire, same rules. You respect it, it does what you ask. You stop respecting it. He made a small gesture with his scarred hand, a kind of soft explosion, and didn't finish the sentence and didn't need to. You thought about that gesture more than once over the following days, standing over the spits with the coals throwing heat against your shins, watching the bakehouse ovens glow orange in their stone throats, hour after hour without rest. You thought about it especially at night, lying on your pallet above a room full of banked fires that never fully went out, listening to the settling creak of old timbers and the newer, sharper creak of the freshly built banqueting hall next door, still smelling of raw wood and green plaster, still not entirely finished, still, you'd heard one of the carpenters mutter to another, not entirely dry. The days themselves ran together into a single long blur of heat and noise, but certain pieces of them stayed sharp, the way certain moments always do even inside an exhausted haze. There was the day of the bear baiting, when 13 bears were set against a pack of mastiffs in a purpose-built ring, while half the court watched from galleries and the noise of it, the roaring, the frantic barking, the crowd's own roar rising and falling with each turn of the fight, carried all the way to the kitchen yard and made even Joan pause for a moment with a half-plucked hen in her hands, her mouth set in a line that told you she didn't much care for the sport, whatever the guests upstairs thought of it. There was the day the Italian tumbler performed in the courtyard, a small wiry man who moved his body in ways that made the watching crowd gasp and laugh in equal measure, twisting and vaulting and balancing in postures no human joint should rightly allow, and you caught perhaps 3 minutes of it from a high window while carrying a tray of pies to the buttery. and it was the first time in 5 days you remembered what it felt like to smile without meaning to. There was the day of the country wedding, a whole pageant staged for the Queen's amusement. Local men and women dressed up as a rustic bride and groom and their wedding party, playing out a mock village wedding with dancing and mummery, and a great deal of good-natured chaos meant to charm a queen who had, presumably, never attended a real one. And you recognised 2 of the bridesmaids as girls from your own village, girls you'd known your whole life, dressed up and paraded in front of the greatest court in the realm to perform a version of their own lives back at them for entertainment, and something about seeing that made your stomach twist in a way you didn't have words for yet. And there was the day, you never learned exactly which day because by then the days had stopped announcing themselves clearly, when the men from Coventry came to perform their Hock Tuesday play, an old story reenacting some ancient victory of English villagers over invading Danes, put on specially for the Queen because someone in the Earl's household had heard the town's regular performance of it had been banned by overzealous local reformers and thought Her Majesty might enjoy reviving it for an afternoon. You didn't see that one either, not properly, only heard the shouting and cheering drift down from the tilt yard, while your hands kept moving through dough that needed kneading, flour working its way into the cracks of your knuckles, your blistered palm complaining every time you pressed down with the heel of your hand. You began to understand, somewhere around the 6th or 7th day, that the entertainments above you were not really for entertainment's own sake at all, not fundamentally. Davy explained it to you one evening while you both sat with your backs against the warm bakehouse wall, too tired to do more than pick at a heel of bread. "My uncle says the Earl wants to marry her," he said. "Has for years. Everybody knows it. This whole thing." He waved a hand vaguely upward, meaning the fireworks and the water pageant and the bear baiting and the endless roasted meat, meaning the entire staggering weight of everything happening above your heads. This is him asking. Just asking bigger than anybody's ever asked anybody anything before. You thought about that for a while, chewing your bread slowly because your jaw ached along with everything else. "Do you think it'll work?" Davy shrugged, the particular shrug of an 11-year-old who has already learned not to invest too much hope in the doings of people who will never know his name. Don't much matter to us either way, does it? She'll say yes or she'll say no, and either way we'll still be turning spits until she leaves. On the 10th day, Joan sent you with a message up to the new garden, because the girl who usually carried messages between the kitchen and the household officers had gone down with a fever from the heat, and somebody was needed who could be spared for the better part of an hour without the whole spit line collapsing. You had heard about the garden from 6 different people by then, each account more disbelieving than the last, but nothing prepared you for actually standing inside it. The Earl had built it fresh that same spring, an acre of ground laid out in a square, walled in on every side with gravel walks wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast, and raised terraces you could climb for a better view of the whole design at once. At each corner stood an obelisk, tall and white and gleaming in the afternoon light, and at the very centre, on a pedestal of stone, a fountain carved with figures out of old myth. Atlas, holding up a globe, water spilling from the globe itself down through channels cut into the stone, so that the whole fountain seemed to be raining upward and downward at once, catching the light and throwing it back in 100 small broken pieces. You had never seen anything built purely to be beautiful. Everything you knew, the castle's old walls, the barns and byres of your own village, even the great kitchen you'd spent 10 days sweating in, had been built to do something, to hold something up or keep something out or cook something through. This garden did nothing at all except exist, except be looked at, except make the eye stop and the breath catch, and standing in the middle of it with your message still undelivered in your fist, you felt for the first time the true size of the gap between the life you knew and the life being lived just a few dozen yards above your head. An aviary stood along one wall, wire strung so fine you could barely see it against the sky. Birds inside it you had no names for, bright plumaged things, foreign things, brought from countries you'd never heard your priest so much as mention, singing and calling in voices that didn't match anything you knew from your own hedgerows. Fruit trees had been planted along the terraces, and though it was too early yet for most of the fruit to have properly formed, you could see the shape of what the garden would become in another year or two. An orchard laid out with the same careful geometry as everything else. Nature itself bent and trained into obedience because the Earl of Leicester did not build things that were allowed to simply grow the way they wanted. You climbed one of the terraces to get your bearings, message still clutched in your fist, and from the top of it you could see out over the garden wall to the mere beyond, silver in the afternoon light, and beyond that the roofs and chimneys of the castle itself, and beyond that, hazy in the distance, the green country rolling away toward home, toward your own village, your own family, your own unharvested barley standing in a field that nobody was tending properly, because the hands that should have been tending it were standing here instead, looking at a fountain that rained water upward for no reason, except that a queen might walk past it and be pleased. You found the household officer you'd been sent to find, delivered Joan's message, and started back down toward the kitchens, and it was on the way down, cutting through a service passage you hadn't used before, that you nearly walked straight into a fire. Not a large one, not yet. A cresset lamp had been left burning too close to a stack of dry rushes laid in for strewing the hall floors, and a curl of smoke was already rising off the topmost layer when you rounded the corner and saw it, small and orange and hungry, exactly the kind of thing that starts as nothing at all and becomes everything within minutes if nobody notices it in time. You didn't think. You grabbed the nearest thing to hand, a length of sacking draped over a barrel, and beat at the smouldering rushes until the curl of smoke stopped rising, stamped the last stubborn ember out under your shoe, and stood there afterward with your heart going so hard you could feel it in your throat, staring at a scorch mark no bigger than your two hands laid flat. That 10 minutes from now, if you hadn't happened to walk that exact passage at that exact moment, might have been something else entirely. You told Joan about it when you got back to the kitchen, mostly because you needed to tell somebody or the fright of it was going to sit in your chest all night, and she listened with her hands still working through a tray of pastry, and when you finished she didn't look nearly as alarmed as you'd expected. Happens, she said. Happens every year on progress somewhere or other. Too many fires, too many candles, too many rushes and hangings and drapery all crammed together in buildings never built to hold this many bodies at once, and half the staff so run off their feet they can't watch everything they should be watching. You did right, putting it out yourself instead of running for help. Fire doesn't wait while you go looking for someone with more authority than you've got. She glanced at you, something in her face that was almost, though not quite, approval. Keep your eyes open the rest of the way through, girl. That's not going to be the last spark loose in this place before the Queen leaves, mark me. You did keep your eyes open after that. It was hard not to. Once you'd seen how close a whole passage of dry rushes had come to catching, you started noticing fire everywhere you looked. the ovens that never went cold, the torches burning along every gallery after dark, the great bonfires lit each evening out past the mere for the pageants and processions, the fireworks that still cracked and bloomed overhead some nights, close enough to the castle's own roofline that you sometimes flinched despite yourself. The whole place was burning, you realised, in 100 small contained ways at once, and it was only the constant vigilance of a great many exhausted people that kept all those small contained fires from finding each other and becoming one large, uncontained one. Nobody above the kitchen seemed to think about it that way. Why would they? They saw torchlight and pageantry, and a sky full of Italian fire blooming in colours no Englishman had ever seen before, and it delighted them, and delight was the entire point of the exercise, and delight does not generally spend much time worrying about what holds it up. Your father came on the 12th day, though you hadn't known to expect him. He came with a cart of produce requisitioned from 3 farms over, driving it because the man who owned it had gone lame and couldn't manage the journey, and when the cart pulled into the yard and you saw his face above the load of turnips and cabbages, you very nearly dropped the tray you were carrying. You had perhaps a quarter of an hour with him, snatched in pieces between his unloading and the clerk's counting, and Joan's patience running thin. And in that quarter hour he told you what you'd already half suspected. The barley was suffering, not ruined, not yet, but suffering, standing too long without enough hands to bring it in properly, and 2 other families in the village had lost daughters to the same summons that had taken you, and old Widow Pike's only son had been taken for carting duty on top of everything else, and she had nobody now to help her at all. "How is mother?" "Tired. Same as you'll be, I expect, looking at you." He studied your face in a way that made you suddenly, sharply aware of how you must look. Hollow-eyed, your hair coming loose from its braid, a burn mark healing pink and shiny on the inside of one wrist that you hadn't even noticed getting. "They treating you decent in there?" "Well enough," you said, which was true, in the sense that Joan was not unkind, and nobody had beaten you, and you were fed, badly but regularly, which was more than some households managed even outside of a royal progress. It was also not the whole truth, and your father's face told you he understood that without your needing to say it plainer. 2 more weeks, they're saying now, he said. Maybe less. The Queen's said to be enjoying herself well enough that nobody knows exactly when she'll choose to move on, and until she does, none of us get our own lives back. He gave you what he could spare from the little he'd brought for himself. A wedge of hard cheese wrapped in a cloth, which you knew, without either of you saying so, represented a portion of food your family could not really afford to give away, not with the barley standing unharvested, and 2 hens already gone to the same feast you were sweating over. And then the clerk called his name for the counting, and he had to go, and you had to go back to your spit, and that was the whole of your visit home in the middle of everything. You ate the cheese slowly that night, sitting on your pallet in the loft with the ovens ticking and creaking below you, and it tasted better than anything that had come off any spit in that kitchen in 12 days, because it had come from your own family's hands and not from a purveyor's requisitioned cart. And there is a difference. You were learning between food that is simply food and food that costs someone you love something they could not easily spare. The unfairness of the whole arrangement sat in your chest that night in a way it hadn't quite managed to before, not as sharply. You thought about the fountain in the garden, raining water upward for no reason but to be beautiful. You thought about the 300 hogsheads of beer, more drink than your whole village would see in a year, drunk down by a court that would ride away in another week or 2, and likely never think of Kenilworth again except as one pleasant stop among many on a long summer's progress. You thought about your father driving a borrowed cart of requisitioned turnips because a lamed man couldn't manage it himself, and Widow Pike alone in her cottage with nobody to help bring in whatever she'd managed to grow, and two other village girls somewhere in this same castle, standing over their own spits or their own washing tubs, missing the same harvest you were missing for the same reason you were missing it. None of it was anyone's fault exactly, in the way that a hailstorm isn't anyone's fault. It was simply how the world above you worked. The way weather is simply how the sky works, indifferent to whether it ruins a harvest or spares one. The Earl of Leicester needed to dazzle a queen, and dazzling a queen required more food and drink and labour than any single county could comfortably spare, and the county would spare it anyway, because that was what counties did when a great household came calling, and no amount of understanding the mechanism of it made the mechanism feel any less like something being taken from you without your consent. You fell asleep with the taste of your father's cheese still in your mouth, and the ache in your shoulders settling in for what felt by then like the whole rest of your life, and somewhere below you the ovens ticked on through the dark, banked but never quite cold, waiting for the next round of bread that would start going in before the sky outside had even begun to lighten. Somewhere around the 9th or 10th day, Joan moved you off the spits for a stretch and put you to work in the boiling house instead, mostly because two of the regular women there had gone down with the same heat fever that had taken the message girl, and a kitchen this size could not afford to let any single station stand short-handed for more than an hour, let alone a full day. The boiling house was its own particular kind of misery, different from the dry roasting heat of the spits, but no gentler for the difference. Great coppers stood in a row along one wall, each one large enough that you could have climbed inside and stood upright with room to spare, and each one kept at a rolling boil from before dawn till well past dark, filled with everything from whole hams to enormous puddings wrapped in cloth, to vats of broth thickening slowly for the next day's soups and sauces. The steam off them didn't rise and vanish the way you might have imagined it would. It hung. It filled the room from floor to rafters in a thick white fog that clung to your skin and your hair and the inside of your throat, so that within an hour of starting your shift there, you were as wet through as if you'd walked into the mere itself, sweat and condensed steam running together down your back and arms until you couldn't have told one from the other. Your job there was mostly lifting, hauling sacks of vegetables to the tables where other hands cut them, dragging full buckets of water to top up coppers that boiled dry faster than seemed possible, and worst of all, helping to lift the great puddings and joints out of the boiling water once they were done, using long wooden tongs and thick folded cloths that never quite kept the heat from finding your hands anyway. You scalded the inside of your left wrist on the second day in that room, a graze of pink, tender skin that stung for a week afterward every time your sleeve brushed against it, and the woman working beside you, a broad, quiet soul named Marjorie, who'd clearly done this work for a decade or more, only glanced at it and said, "Cold water, quick as you can, then keep working," in the flat tone of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by burns and had learned there was no profit in making a fuss over one. You made a friend in that room, in the strange compressed way you make friends when exhaustion strips away most of the ordinary caution people carry around each other. Her name was Cecily, a girl your own age from a village on the far side of the castle's lands, sent in the same wave of requisitioned labour that had taken you, and the two of you fell into an easy rhythm within a single shared afternoon. passing buckets, trading small complaints under your breath when Marjorie's back was turned, comparing the particular ways your own hands had begun to blister and toughen in the days since you'd arrived. My mother says girls who go into service for a great house come back either harder or softer, Cecily told you one evening. Both of you slumped against the boiling house's outer wall in the 10 minutes rest Marjorie allowed before the evening's second round of coppers needed refilling. Never the same as they went in either way. Which do you think you'll come back as? She considered this with the particular seriousness of someone too tired to be anything but honest. Harder, I think. You thought about your blistered palm and the scorch mark you'd beaten out with a length of sacking, and the ache that had settled so deep into your shoulders it no longer felt separate from the rest of you. I don't know yet, you admitted. Ask me again when we're both home. Cecily laughed at that, a real laugh, tired but genuine, and it was one of the few moments in that whole exhausting fortnight when you remembered, clearly and without effort, that you were still a girl of 14 and not simply a pair of hands attached to a body that existed to keep coppers boiling and spits turning. You saw the Queen herself only once properly, close enough to make out her face rather than just the shape and colour of her at a distance. And it happened almost by accident, the way the most memorable things at Kenilworth kept happening to you. Not through any plan, but through being sent on an errand at exactly the wrong or exactly the right moment. You had been sent up with a tray of sweetmeats meant for one of the withdrawing chambers, a task usually given to one of the household's own senior servants, but handed to you instead because the regular girl had turned her ankle on the stairs and there was no time to find anyone better suited before the tray was wanted. You carried it up a servant's stair you'd never used before, through a passage that opened, unexpectedly, onto a gallery running along the edge of the great garden, and there, walking below among the obelisks and the reigning fountain with two of her ladies a respectful few paces behind, was the Queen of England. You had imagined her, in the days leading up to that moment, as something larger than life, something closer to the figures painted onto church walls than to an actual woman who walked and breathed and grew tired the way anyone did. What you saw instead, looking down from that gallery with your tray of sweetmeats forgotten in your two hands, was a woman perhaps in her 40s, dressed in cloth so fine it seemed to catch and hold the light differently than ordinary fabric, moving with a straight-backed, unhurried grace that made everyone around her seem, by comparison, slightly too eager, slightly too quick. She paused near the fountain, tilted her head to study the figure of Atlas holding up his stone globe, and said something to one of her ladies that made the woman laugh, and for just a moment, before you remembered yourself and hurried on with your tray, you caught the sound of the Queen's own laugh carrying up through the warm evening air, unguarded and entirely human, nothing at all like the painted saints on your parish church's walls. It struck you, walking on with your tray of sweetmeats and your heart beating a little too fast, that this one woman's laugh, this one unhurried afternoon walk through a garden built specifically to please her, had cost your father 2 hens and your family a portion of its harvest, and Widow Pike her only son's help through a summer she badly needed it, and that she almost certainly had no idea any of that was true, not in any way that touched her directly, not in any way that would keep her from enjoying her walk through the garden a single moment less. It wasn't cruelty in her exactly, you decided, turning the thought over as you climbed back down the servant's stair. It was simply distance. She was too far above the fields and villages that had paid for this fortnight to feel their weight the way you felt it, the same way you yourself, turning a spit 12 hours a day, could not have named a single one of the 1,000 small costs and sacrifices that had gone into building the castle's walls 100 years before your own family had ever settled nearby. Everyone stood somewhere on that ladder, you were beginning to understand, and the view from each rung looked entirely different. And the higher up you stood, the less of the ladder below you it was possible to see at all. The day of the country wedding pageant, you found yourselves, you and Cecily both, given a rare shared errand. Close enough to the tilt yard to watch a portion of it properly, and it was there you spotted the two girls from your own village, dressed up as bridesmaids, cheeks rouged, ribbons woven through their hair, playing at a wedding for the entertainment of a court that would never know either of their real names. You knew them both. Alice Turner, whose father kept bees 2 farms over from yours, and Joan Prentice, a different Joan from your kitchen Joan, though you'd laughed about the coincidence with Davy more than once, whose mother had nursed your own mother through a hard winter fever some years back. Seeing them up there, capering and curtsying in borrowed finery for a crowd of strangers who would forget their faces within the hour, put a strange lump in your throat that you didn't fully understand until later that night, lying on your pallet turning it over in your mind. It wasn't that the pageant was cruel to them exactly. Alice looked, if anything, delighted with herself, flushed and laughing in a way that suggested she was having rather a wonderful afternoon. It was something else, the sense that your whole village, all of it, every hen and every daughter and every hour of unharvested barley, had become raw material for somebody else's entertainment that summer, performed and consumed, and then, in a matter of weeks, entirely forgotten by everyone above the kitchens except as a pleasant memory of one especially fine progress. You would remember Kenilworth for the rest of your life. You already understood that, even at 14, even in the middle of it. You doubted very much that the Queen would remember Alice Turner's face at all 6 months from now, let alone her name. The days kept their brutal, blurring pace after that. More spits, more coppers, more bread going into ovens that never cooled. Your body settling further into the strange, numb rhythm that let you keep working long after your mind had grown too tired to properly notice what your hands were doing. You learned the particular ache of standing on stone floors for 18 hours at a stretch, a deep bone weariness in your feet and ankles that no amount of rest in your 10 stolen minutes ever fully undid. You learned to sleep sitting upright briefly, leaning against a warm wall while a tray of pastry baked, snapping awake the instant the smell told you it was close to done. You learned the particular grief of watching food you'd spent hours preparing carried away to a table you would never sit at, and the particular relief of the rare evening when the leftover ends and trimmings did make their way back down to the kitchen for the servants themselves to eat, meat that had touched the edges of the Queen's own feast now filling your own empty stomach instead. And through all of it, underneath the exhaustion and the heat and the constant low hum of unfairness you had stopped bothering to name out loud, there was still, somehow, a kind of pride growing in you that you hadn't expected to find. You were 14 years old, and you had helped feed more than 1,000 people a day for over 2 weeks running, and whatever the cost of it to your own family's harvest, whatever the distance between the Queen's unhurried garden walk and your own blistered, aching hands, you had done the work every single day, without breaking. And there was something in that, something Joan seemed to see too in the small, approving glances she had started giving you by the second week, that felt, on your better days, almost worth carrying home. There was a day of hunting somewhere around the 13th, when the Queen and a large party of her court rode out into the chase attached to the castle grounds, and the kitchen spent the whole of that morning and afternoon in a different kind of frenzy altogether, preparing not for a fixed feast at a fixed hour, but for the uncertain, rolling demands of a hunt that might return at any moment with any quantity of game, and expect it dressed and cooked before the light failed. You were sent that day to help in the butchery yard rather than at your usual spit, because the returning huntsman had brought in more than the regular butchers could manage alone. Deer mostly, a great many of them, carted in still warm from the chase, and hung from hooks along a beam that ran the length of the yard, and your job, alongside half a dozen others, was simple in description and brutal in practice. Hold the carcass steady while the butcher's knife did its work, and afterward carry away whatever portion you were handed to whichever part of the kitchen needed it next. You had helped your own father dress a hog once or twice at home, at the autumn slaughtering, so the work itself wasn't entirely foreign to you, but the scale of it here was something else again. The smell filled the whole yard. Blood and hide and the particular sweetish rot edge that meat gives off even when perfectly fresh, mixing with wood smoke drifting over from the kitchen fires, and the sharper reek of the tanning scraps set aside in one corner for whoever would eventually collect them. Flies gathered thick despite the men working to keep them off, and your hands by the end of the afternoon had gone stiff and sticky, past any feeling of disgust, simply another kind of tired that sat alongside all your other kinds of tired. The butcher you worked closest to that day was an older man named Peter Hollis, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some accident he never explained and nobody thought to ask about, and he worked with the kind of economy of motion that comes only from decades of repeating the same cuts on the same joints until the body no longer needs the mind's permission to make them. "You're quick," he said to you at one point, not looking up from the haunch he was jointing, "for a girl who's never done this at this size before. I've helped at home, just smaller. Everything here's just smaller, back where you came from." He set down his knife for a moment, flexed his maimed hand, studied you with an assessing look you were getting used to from the older servants by then. The look of people deciding how much truth a new arrival could actually bear. You'll go home from this thinking the whole world runs the way it runs up here. It doesn't. This is a fever, girl, not a fashion. Comes on hard, burns through everything it touches, and then it's gone again, and the county goes back to being exactly what it always was, just a bit poorer for having hosted it. Don't let a fortnight like this one teach you to expect the ordinary world to look like it. The ordinary world is your father's field and your mother's hearth, and it'll still be there waiting for you long after nobody remembers what colour the Italians made the sky. You thought about that more than once in the days that followed, turning it over the way you turned over most of the hard, useful things people said to you in that kitchen. It felt true in a way that comforted you slightly, set against the vast unfairness of everything else you'd seen. The idea that Kenilworth was an aberration, and not a preview, a fever, and not a fashion, something the whole county would recover from rather than a new permanent shape the world had quietly decided to take. You held on to that thought hard in the exhausted days still ahead of you, the way you might hold onto a rail going down a steep stair in the dark. The evenings in that second week had begun to blur together in a way the first week's evenings hadn't. You remembered isolated pieces, the particular ache of climbing the loft ladder one night with your knees barely bending properly, the taste of a bowl of pottage eaten too fast because you'd fallen half asleep between spoonfuls, Cecily's low laugh in the dark beside you, as the 2 of you traded whispered complaints about Marjorie's temper, before sleep finally, mercifully, pulled you both under. But the days themselves had stopped presenting themselves to your memory as separate units at all, folding instead into one long continuous stretch of heat and smoke and aching hands that would only, looking back on it years later, resolve itself into anything like a clear sequence. What stayed sharp, cutting through all that blur, was the accumulating sense that everyone around you was fraying at the same rate you were, that the whole enormous machine of the household was running on a debt of rest it had no intention of ever repaying until the Queen herself finally chose to leave. You watched grown men and women you'd have sworn, in the first days, were simply built sturdier than you, start to show the same small cracks you felt in yourself. Rafe's hands trembling faintly by the 15th day, where they'd been perfectly steady on the first, one of the senior cooks snapping at a scullery boy over nothing at all, and then, a moment later, apologising in a voice gone suddenly thin with something close to tears, Joan herself going quiet for longer and longer stretches, her usual brisk chatter thinning out into the kind of silence that comes only from a body running on fumes and a mind too tired to spare the energy for talk it doesn't strictly need. You understood, without anyone spelling it out for you, that the household was approaching some kind of edge, the way a fire that's been fed too long and too hard without proper tending approaches its own edge, and that everyone around you could feel it too, in their own bodies, in the particular quality of exhaustion that had stopped being ordinary tiredness and started becoming something closer to danger. By the 16th day, the whole household had stopped pretending it wasn't running on the very edge of what human bodies could sustain. You saw it in Joan, whose hands had started to shake faintly by mid-afternoon, in a way they hadn't in the first week, small tremors she covered by keeping them busy every second she could. You saw it in Davy, who had gone quiet in a way that worried you more than his usual chatter, answering questions in single words and staring at nothing. During the rare moments he wasn't turning a spit or hauling water. You saw it in yourself, in the mirror of a still pail of water one morning, a face gone thin and grey-shadowed under the eyes that you barely recognised as your own, and in the way your hands had started doing their work, almost without your mind's involvement at all, some deeper animal part of you keeping the rhythm going long after the thinking part had simply gone somewhere else to rest. The Earl had planned a final grand banquet for the evening of the 18th day, the last full night before the Queen's household began the slow business of packing and moving on, and the kitchens had been building toward it for nearly a week. Extra ovens fired, extra hands brought in from villages further afield now that the nearer ones had been thoroughly wrung dry of both food and labour. A march of preparation that had been intense from the very first day and had somehow, impossibly, found another gear to climb into as the visit's climax approached. You worked through the whole of the 18th day in something close to a fever dream. The great hearths roared from before dawn. The bakehouse ovens, never cold in 19 days, had been stoked harder than at any point before, because the final banquet called for more bread, more pastry, more of everything than any single night before it, a last enormous gesture meant to send the Queen away, remembering Kenilworth as the finest hospitality she had ever received in her life. By the time full dark fell, you had been on your feet for nearly 18 hours, and the kitchen around you had the particular, over-bright, half-hysterical energy of a room full of exhausted people, pushing past every reasonable limit because there was no other option available to them. Voices came sharper and quicker than usual. Small mistakes multiplied, a dropped tray here, a scorched crust there, a boy who nicked his own thumb badly enough with a boning knife that Joan had to stop and bind it herself, cursing under her breath the whole time, not at him, but at the general unfairness of asking this much of anybody for this many days running. You were sent to the bakehouse sometime past 10 that night, ostensibly to help carry the last of the evening's bread trays, but really you understood without being told, because the bakehouse crew had been at their ovens even longer than the spit-turners, and Joan had judged correctly that they needed every spare pair of hands they could get. The bakehouse at that hour was a different world from the great kitchen, narrower, hotter if such a thing were possible, 3 ovens built into the outer wall glowing deep orange in their stone throats, the air thick enough with flour dust and wood smoke that you could taste it on your tongue with every breath. The baker in charge, a broad, silent man named Rafe, who had barely spoken a full sentence to you in 19 days, was moving between the ovens with the particular mechanical exhaustion of someone who had stopped consciously deciding anything hours ago and was simply continuing to move because stopping had not yet occurred to his body as an option. You worked the peel, the long wooden paddle used to slide loaves in and draw them out, for the better part of an hour, sweat running steady down your spine, your arms shaking with a fatigue that had gone past aching into something closer to numbness. And it was somewhere in that hour, in the deep, small stretch of the night when even a household this size runs thinnest on both attention and daylight, that you noticed the smell had changed. Not bread, not wood smoke, not exactly. Not the ordinary thick haze that had hung in that room for 19 days straight. Something sharper, something with an edge to it that made the hair on your arms lift before your tired mind had even worked out why. You looked up from the peel and saw it. A thin, dark line of smoke curling up from behind the third oven, from the space where the wood store had been stacked too close, too high, too dry after 19 days of a July that hadn't seen rain, against a wall that had been absorbing the heat of that oven for the better part of 3 weeks, without a single hour's real rest. Rafe. Your voice came out smaller than you meant it to, swallowed half by the roar of the ovens. You said it again, louder, and this time he turned, and his face went from exhausted to something else entirely in the space of a single heartbeat. The wood store caught properly in the next few seconds, the way dry things catch when they've been waiting long enough. Not a curl of smoke anymore, but lick of orange flame running up the stacked kindling, quick and hungry, finding the dry timber of the wall above it almost before either of you could move, Rafe shouted. It wasn't a word, not really, just a raw sound of alarm that carried through the thin wall into the great kitchen beyond, and within seconds the bakehouse had gone from a tired, quiet room to something closer to chaos. Bodies shoving through the narrow doorway, someone's hands wrenching a bucket from its hook, someone else's voice screaming for water in a pitch you'd never heard a grown man use. You grabbed the nearest thing your own hands could find, which happened to be a heavy wet sack of flour half emptied earlier that evening, and without thinking through the decision at all, you swung it at the base of the flames the way you had beaten out the smouldering rushes 12 days before. Except this fire was not a curl of smoke in a service passage. This fire had already climbed a full arm's length up a dry timber wall, and showed no sign of caring what you threw at it. The heat off it hit your face like a slap. Your eyes streamed instantly, smoke thick enough now to make you cough, and somewhere behind you Joan's voice was shouting your name along with a dozen others, organising a bucket line with the same brisk efficiency she brought to gutting rabbits, because that was what Joan did with a crisis. She simply worked it the way she worked everything else, fast and without wasted motion. Water came. Bucket after bucket passed hand to hand from the well in the yard, thrown against the base of the flames in a rhythm that felt both frantically fast and agonizingly slow at once, the way time does when everything depends on the next few minutes going right. The fire fought back against every bucket, hissing, spitting steam, finding new dry wood to climb toward even as the wet stuff below it went black and sodden. And for a stretch of time you couldn't afterward have measured in minutes or in hours. It felt entirely uncertain which side was going to win. Your whole body had narrowed down to the single task of the bucket line by then, nothing left over for thought. You felt the rough, wet wood of each handle bite fresh into palms already blistered raw from 19 days of spit turning. Felt the shock of cold water slop over your wrists and down the front of your dress with every pass. Felt your own breath tearing ragged in your chest from smoke and heat and simple animal fear. The roar of the fire had a voice all its own, a low hungry crackle underneath the hiss of the water hitting it, and beneath that, threading through everything, the frightened shouts of a dozen people who had all, in the space of a few minutes, become entirely unimportant to each other, except as extra hands in a chain that could not afford a single weak link. Somewhere in the smoke a woman was praying out loud, the words tumbling together too fast to make out, and somewhere else a man's voice kept up a steady low stream of curses that nobody had the breath to tell him to stop. You caught, once, a glimpse of your own hands in the firelight, red and shaking and streaked black with ash, and didn't recognize them for a half-second as belonging to you at all, before the next bucket landed in your grip and pulled your attention back to the only thing that mattered. The heat came off the flames in waves that pressed against your face like something solid, drying your eyes even as they streamed, and every few seconds a fresh gust of smoke rolled low across the room and swallowed the whole scene into grey, so that you were fighting half the time by sound and memory rather than sight, throwing water toward a glow you could feel more than see. Your legs had gone rubbery beneath you, 18 hours of standing already behind you before the fire had even started, and still you kept moving, kept passing, kept throwing, because stopping was not a thought your body was willing to entertain while the flame still had any life left in it at all. Your arms, already shaking with 18 hours of kitchen labour before this had even started, took bucket after bucket and passed them on, and took the next, over and over, the rough wet wood biting into your blistered palms, water sloshing cold and shocking down your wrists and the front of your dress with every pass, your throat raw from smoke, your eyes streaming so badly you were half fighting blind. Somewhere in the middle of it, a beam near the roofline gave a groan and a crack that stopped every heart in that room for a single suspended second. A sound like the whole builder deciding whether or not it wanted to keep standing, and then it held, smoked, blackened, but held, and the water kept coming, and slowly, agonizingly, the flames began to lose ground. It took perhaps 20 minutes from the moment the wood store caught to the moment the last visible flame guttered out under a final bucket thrown by Rafe himself, though it felt, living inside those 20 minutes, like the whole of the 19 days condensed down into one single unbearable stretch of time. When it was finally, truly out, nothing left but blackened timber, sodden ash, and a room full of people standing in scorched, soaked clothes, chests heaving, coughing on smoke that hadn't yet cleared from the air, Nobody said anything for a long moment. There was just the sound of everyone breathing, and the drip of water off the ruined wood, and somewhere very far above you, through walls thick enough that the crisis below had never once disturbed it, the faint distant sound of music still playing in the banqueting hall, where the Queen of England and her whole glittering court were finishing the last course of the finest supper Robert Dudley knew how to give her, entirely unaware of how close the building around them had just come to a different kind of ending altogether. Joan found you sitting against the outer wall of the bakehouse some minutes later, knees drawn up, hands still shaking, a graze along one forearm you didn't remember getting stinging fiercely, now that the worst of the fright had drained out of you and left room for smaller pains to make themselves known. She lowered herself down beside you without a word, which was itself unusual enough that you turned to look at her properly for the first time since the fire had started. Her own hands were scraped raw across the knuckles, her sleeves scorched black along one edge, a streak of soot running from her temple down into her hair. "You did well," she said after a while, "grabbing that flour sack before you'd even thought about it. That's the difference between people who freeze and people who don't, and you're the second kind, whatever else you might think of yourself right now. You didn't feel like the second kind. You felt like your whole body had been wrung out and hung up to dry, and then set alight itself for good measure. The beam, you said, the one that cracked. Would it have? Might have brought the roof down that section. Might not have. We'll never know because it didn't, and there's no profit thinking too hard about the roads not taken." She said it briskly, the way she said most things, but you caught something underneath it, a thread of something that might have been fear aloud. Finally, a few minutes of daylight now that the danger itself had passed. Rafe was already directing men to clear the ruined wood store, working with the same silent mechanical exhaustion as before, except now there was something almost tender in how carefully he checked the ovens themselves, running a hand along the stone throat of each one, checking for cracks, for weakness, the way you might check an animal for injury after it had bolted and been caught again. "Will they tell the Earl?" you asked. Joan snorted, though there wasn't much humour in it. "Someone'll have to. Can't hide a scorched wall and a wrecked wood store, not with the household clerks counting every stick of timber that comes through these gates. But he won't hear of it tonight, and probably not tomorrow either, not with the Queen still here and everything still needing to run smooth as glass in front of her. Whatever gets said will get said quiet, and it'll get said by someone senior enough that it doesn't cost the rest of us our places. That's how it works in a house this size. The trouble gets carried upwards slow and careful, wrapped in enough padding that it doesn't wake anybody up who doesn't need waking. You thought about that, about how a fire that had nearly taken the roof off the bakehouse, that had come within a beam's cracking point of turning into something far worse, would be smoothed and softened and carried upwards so gently that the Earl himself might never hear the full truth of how close it had come, while down here, in the room where it actually happened, every single person who'd carried a bucket would remember it for the rest of their lives. That seemed, in that moment, like the truest thing you had learned in 16 days at Kenilworth. The higher a thing happened in that castle, the more people it touched, the more carefully it got dressed up before anyone above was allowed to see it. The danger you had actually lived through, the smoke in your throat, the heat on your face, the beam's crack that had stopped your heart, would become, by the time it reached whatever ears it eventually reached, a minor mishap, quickly handled, nothing worth troubling anyone over. The truth of it would stay down here, in the bodies that had actually fought it, in your own scraped arm and Joan's scorched sleeve, and Rafe's silent, careful hands running over the ovens he'd spent 19 days feeding without a single hour's rest. They worked you through the rest of that night, clearing the ruined wood store, hauling out blackened timber still faintly warm, sweeping ash that clung to everything it touched, and turned your sweat-soaked clothes grey wherever it settled. Nobody slept properly. By the time the sky outside began its first grey lightening toward dawn, you had been on your feet for nearly 24 hours straight, and your body had passed through exhaustion into some strange, clear-eyed state beyond it, where your hands kept working steadily, even though your mind had gone somewhere thin and floating, disconnected from the effort your arms were still making. A steward came through sometime after first light, one of the senior men from the Earl's own household staff, and surveyed the damage with a face that gave away almost nothing. No anger, no particular alarm, just the flat assessing look of a man doing arithmetic in his head, weighing the cost of the ruined timber and the delayed morning baking against whatever explanation he was going to offer to whoever asked him about it. "Anyone hurt bad?" he asked. And it was, you noticed, the very first thing anyone in authority had asked since the fire started. Not what happened, not whose fault it was, just anyone hurt bad, which suggested he already understood, without needing telling, that a wood store stacked too close to an oven that had run 3 weeks without a proper rest was simply the kind of thing that happened at the far end of a feast like this one, an arithmetic problem rather than a moral failing, the inevitable result of asking too much of too little for too long. Nobody was hurt bad, as it turned out. Scrapes and small burns, and Rafe's own hands, blistered along both palms from handling water buckets and hot timber both, but nothing that wouldn't heal on its own, given time nobody in that kitchen was actually going to be given. The steward nodded once at the news, made a note on a small tablet he carried, and left as briskly as he'd arrived, off to smooth this piece of trouble into whatever shape it needed to take before it travelled upward to ears that mattered. Breakfast that morning was bread baked in ovens still smelling faintly of smoke, served to a kitchen full of people moving like they were under water, and you ate yours sitting on an overturned crate because your legs had finally, quietly, refused to hold you upright a moment longer than absolutely necessary. Davy sat beside you, silent, a fresh burn mark shining pink across 2 knuckles that he hadn't mentioned to anyone and wasn't going to. "You were in it too," you said, noticing it properly for the first time. He shrugged, the same shrug he always gave when the subject was something too large for an 11-year-old to have useful feelings about out loud. Everyone was in it. Doesn't matter now. Fire's out. Fire's out. It became, over the following days, something close to a private saying between the two of you, a way of naming any small crisis that had passed. A scorched pastry, a dropped tray, a scolding from Joan that stung less once you'd both survived an actual fire together, and it carried, underneath the joke of it, something more serious neither of you ever quite said aloud, that you had stood together in a room that nearly burned, that you'd passed buckets hand to hand with people whose names you barely knew until the danger made them matter, and that surviving a thing like that together left a mark that had nothing to do with the burns healing on your skin. You kept something from that night, though you never told anyone, not even Davy, not for years. While clearing the ruined wood store in the grey light before dawn, your fingers had closed around a small scorched fragment of timber, no bigger than your thumb, blackened along one edge but still recognisably part of the wall that had nearly brought the whole bakehouse down around you. You didn't decide to keep it exactly. It was more that your hand closed around it and simply didn't open again, and by the time you noticed what you were holding, it had already become something you weren't willing to set back down. You wrapped it in a scrap of cloth torn from the hem of your own shift and kept it tucked inside your bundle for the rest of your time at Kenilworth, and you carried it home with you when the day finally came, and it stayed with you for the rest of your life. Not because it was valuable, not because anyone else would have understood why a burnt splinter of wood mattered to a girl who had spent 19 days at the greatest feast England had ever seen, but because it was the one piece of that whole overwhelming, exhausting, beautiful, unfair fortnight that belonged entirely to you and to no one else. Not the Earl's spectacle, not the Queen's pleasure, not even Joan's kitchen, not really, because the kitchen belonged to the household and you had only ever been borrowed into it. This one small scorched piece of wood was yours, proof that you had stood in a fire and helped put it out and walked away carrying something of it with you, in a place where almost nothing else that happened to you during those 19 days has been within your own choosing. The Queen left Kenilworth on the 27th day of July, 19 days after her floating island welcome on the mere, and by the time her household's long train of carts and horses and liveried men finally wound its way out through the gatehouse and off down the road, the entire castle had the particular stunned, hollowed-out quiet of a place that had been holding its breath for nearly 3 weeks, and had finally at last been allowed to let it out. You didn't see the Queen's actual departure. You were 3 rooms deep in the great kitchen when it happened, scrubbing coppers that hadn't had a proper cleaning in longer than anyone wanted to admit. And the news reached you the way most news reach the kitchens, second-hand and slightly breathless, carried by whoever happened to be passing close enough to a window at the right moment. What you heard, in the days that followed, filtering down through stewards and grooms and the kind of household gossip that moves faster than any official announcement ever could, was that the Earl had not, in the end, gotten the answer he'd spent this entire staggering fortnight trying to earn. The Queen had not agreed to marry him. Whatever private conversations had passed between them in the garden with its raining fountain and its foreign birds, and there had been private conversations, everyone agreed on that much, long walks and quiet talk, that the whole court had noticed and speculated over endlessly. None of it had ended in the yes that all of Kenilworth's fire and pageantry and staggering expense had been built to win. She rode away exactly as unmarried as she had ridden in, and the Earl of Leicester, so the whispers said, had worn a very careful, very controlled expression as he watched her go. The expression of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time in 15 years of trying, that this particular door was not going to open no matter how many fireworks he set off in front of it. You thought about that for a long time afterward, about all the beer and beef and venison, all the requisitioned hens and borrowed carts and lost harvests scattered across a dozen villages, all of it spent in service of a question that had, in the end, simply been answered no, the same as it always had been, the same as it always would be. You thought about your father's 2 hens and Widow Pike's absent son, and the barley standing too long in the field. All of it weighed against a courtship that hadn't succeeded, and you understood, without anyone needing to explain it to you in so many words, that this was simply what it cost to ask a queen a question that large. Whether the answer came back yes or no, the county paid the same price either way, and nobody upstairs was ever going to think to apologise for it. The leftover food at least did not go entirely to waste. In the days after the Queen's household departed, with the Earl's own retinue beginning the long work of settling back into ordinary life, and the specially built galleries and pavilions starting to come down piece by piece, the household stewards made the decision, grudgingly Joan said, and only because so much of it would have spoiled otherwise, to distribute what remained of the feast's excess to the villages that had supplied it, not evenly and not generously, but enough that when you finally walked home yourself, footsore and hollow-eyed and carrying your bundle with the scorched splinter of wood hidden inside it, your own family's table that first night back had meat on it that hadn't come from your father's own stock. Salted mutton and a wheel of hard cheese sent down from the castle's stores as part of the general clearing out. It felt strange, eating food that had been meant for the Queen of England's table, sitting at your own family's board with your mother fussing over how thin you'd gotten, and your father asking careful questions about the fire he'd already heard rumours of from the Carter's circuit. It tasted good. Better than good. Rich in a way your family's ordinary meals never were, seasoned with spices you couldn't name, and you understood, eating it, that this single meal was probably the closest your family would ever come to tasting the world the Earl of Leicester actually lived in. A single evening's leftover grandeur handed down the ladder, because the alternative was letting it rot. You told your family about the fire that night, though you softened it in the telling the way Joan had predicted the household would soften it for the Earl. Not because you meant to lie, but because some of what had happened in that bakehouse, the beams crack and the 20 minutes when nobody knew which way the fight was going to go, felt too large and too raw to hand over whole to people who hadn't stood inside it with you. Your mother's face went pale anyway at the parts you did tell, and she reached across the table and gripped your wrist hard enough to hurt, and didn't let go again for a long moment. And you understood that some things, however carefully you dressed them up, still carry their full weight through to the people who love you. The harvest, when it finally came in that autumn, was thinner than it should have been. A direct cost of the days you and half the village's other young hands had spent at the castle instead of in the fields. It was not a disaster, not a year anyone would remember as a true hunger year, but it was leaner than it needed to be, and your family felt it through the winter that followed in small, unglamorous ways. A little less put by, a little more careful counting of what remained in the store by February, a little more thinness in your own face by the time spring finally came around again. Nobody in the great house upriver ever knew that cost, or thought to ask about it, and you understood by then that this too was simply the arithmetic of the thing, the same arithmetic that had sent purveyors' carts through your village all that summer, taking what they needed as whatever price suited them. The county had paid for the Earl's 19 days of splendour in more currencies than beer and venison, and most of those currencies were never going to show up in anybody's official accounting. You said your own goodbyes the morning you left, in the strange flat manner people say goodbye when they're too exhausted to feel the full weight of what's ending, and only understand it properly days or weeks later, once the body has finally caught up on enough sleep to let the mind grieve at all. Cecily left a day ahead of you, her own village lying in the opposite direction from yours, and the two of you had exactly a few minutes in the kitchen yard to say what there was to say, both of you still in your soot-marked work clothes because nobody had thought to give either of you time to change before your carts arrived. "Write to me," Cecily said, which was a foolish thing for either of you to say, since neither of you could write more than your own names, and you both knew it and laughed about it anyway. The kind of laugh that comes right before tears if you let it go on a moment too long. "I'll come find you instead," you said, "some fair day, some market." You never did in the end. The distance between your two villages was greater than either of you had judged it to be. standing there in a shared kitchen yard where everything nearby had felt close, simply because you were both so far from anywhere familiar, and the ordinary pull of your own separate lives, once you were both home again, proved stronger than the promise had been. But you thought of her often in the years that followed, whenever a particular smell of steam and boiling meat caught you unexpectedly in your own kitchen, and you hoped, without ever confirming it, that she'd gone home harder rather than softer, the way she'd guessed she would. Davy, you said goodbye to last, catching him at the spits on your final morning, his small hands still turning a handle, worn smooth from 3 straight weeks of his own grip alongside yours. He didn't look up right away when you told him you were leaving. "Fire's out," he said eventually, which had become by then shorthand between the two of you for nearly everything worth saying, and you understood it to mean something like, "We survived this together, and that matters, even if neither of us has the words for exactly how." "Fire's out," you agreed, and touched his shoulder briefly and left him there turning his spit, because someone still had to, right up until the very last hour before the ovens finally, blessedly, were allowed to go properly cold for the first time in 19 days. Joan walked you as far as the gatehouse herself, which surprised you, since she'd never once in 3 weeks left the kitchen for anything short of a genuine emergency, and she didn't say very much on the short walk, only pressed a small twist of paper into your hand as you reached the gate and told you not to open it until you were well clear of the walls. You opened it on the road home, once Kenilworth's towers had shrunk to a grey smudge behind you, and found inside it a pinch of the same fine white sugar that had gone into the Queen's own sweetmeats. More sugar than your family would otherwise see in a year, wrapped up small enough to fit in your closed fist and precious enough that you carried it the rest of the way home pressed against your chest like something that might break. "For your trouble," was all the note tucked in beside it said, in a hand you guessed belonged to Joan herself, though you never confirmed that either, because you never saw her again after that morning at the gate, not even on your one return visit 2 years later, when you asked after her and were told only that she'd gone on to another household the following spring, one great kitchen after another, the way women like Joan simply went on doing the work that women like Joan had always done, whether anyone thought to remember their names for it or not. You went back to Kenilworth Castle only once more in your life, nearly 2 years after the Queen's visit, on an errand for your father that took you within sight of the gatehouse for the first time since you'd walked out of it, half dead on your feet, in the last week of that long July. It looked smaller than you remembered. That was the strangest part of seeing it again. Not that anything about the castle had actually changed, but that your own memory of it had grown so large in the telling and retelling, in the way a single overwhelming fortnight of your girlhood had settled into legend inside your own head, that the real stone walls in front of you seemed almost modest by comparison. The new banqueting range still stood, of course, its glass windows catching the afternoon light the same way they had the summer the Queen came, but the garden beyond the walls, the one with its obelisks and its reigning fountain and its foreign birds, had already begun, you heard from a groom you recognised from your kitchen days, to fall into a quieter, less tended state. The Earl's attention pulled toward other business, other courtships of favour that didn't require quite so staggering an outlay of borrowed county wealth. You didn't go inside. There was no reason to, and no one there any longer who would have known your name. You stood at a distance instead, on the same road you'd walked in on as a frightened 14-year-old with a bundle under her arm, and you let yourself remember, properly, for the first time since it had happened, the whole shape of those 19 days. the ache in your shoulder that had taken most of a month to fully leave you, the smell of goose fat and wood smoke that still, 2 years on, could catch you unexpectedly and drop you straight back into that kitchen if you weren't braced for it, the crack of Italian fireworks against a summer sky, the water pageant and the floating island, and poor Harry Goldingham breaking character inside his painted dolphin because his stomach couldn't take another moment of pretending to be a god, and underneath all of it, holding the whole memory together the way a keel holds together a ship, the 20 minutes in the bakehouse when you hadn't known whether the roof was going to come down on top of you or not. You thought about Robert Dudley too, standing there on the road, though you had never once in your life laid eyes on the man himself, not properly, not close enough to see his face rather than just the shape of him, at a distance across a courtyard. You had heard by then that he had gone on trying for the Queen's hand in various quiet ways for a few more years after Kenilworth, and that she had gone on saying no in various quiet ways of her own, and that eventually, though this news reached you much later, well into your own middle years, he had married someone else entirely, a widow named Lettice, in a match the Queen found out about and was, by every account, furious over for a very long time. You wondered, standing on that road, whether the fireworks and the water pageant and the raining fountain had been worth it to him, in the end, given how it had all actually turned out. You never did decide an answer to that question you were satisfied with. It wasn't really your question to answer. You'd only ever been the girl turning the spit 2 floors below where the real decisions got made, and the real decisions had never once required your opinion on them. You married 3 years after that, a tenant farmer's son from a village not far from your own, a steady, unremarkable man who had never once in his life set foot inside Kenilworth Castle, and had no particular interest in doing so, and you raised 4 children with him across the following decades, and you told them, when they were old enough to sit still and listen, the story of the summer you spent turning spits for the greatest feast England had ever seen. They loved the fireworks part best when they were small, the cracks loud enough to be heard 20 miles off, the colours nobody in the village had ever seen fire make before. As they got older, the parts that held their attention longest shifted, the way a story's true centre always does shift depending on who's old enough to hear it properly. The purveyors taking your father's hens at a price that wasn't a price at all, the harvest that came in thin the year you were gone, and always, every time, the fire in the bakehouse, the beam that cracked and held, the 20 minutes when a 14-year-old girl grabbed the nearest thing to hand and started swinging it at flames without waiting to be told it was her job to do so. You are an old woman now, sitting by your own hearth on an evening not so different from 1,000 others, and your youngest granddaughter has climbed up onto the bench beside you the way she does most nights, wanting the story again, though she's heard it more times than either of you could count. Tell the fire part, she says, the way she always does, and you find the small scorched splinter of wood you have kept wrapped in the same scrap of cloth for more than 50 years now, kept it through your marriage, and through raising your children, and through more moves and more hardships than you ever imagined enduring back when you were 14, and terrified of a castle that turned out to be, in the end, just a building, full of ordinary, exhausted people doing extraordinary amounts of work for someone else's glory. There was a queen, you begin, the way you always begin, and there was a man who loved her, or said he did, and he built her a garden with a fountain that rained water upward, just to look at, just to be beautiful, and there was a lake with an island that wasn't there in the morning and was there by evening, and a man inside a painted fish who got so seasick he forgot to be a god, and just told the Queen the truth instead, which made her laugh harder than anything else in the whole 3 weeks. And there was fire in the sky loud enough to crack windows 20 miles off, and there was a girl not much older than your own sister, standing at a spit turning a goose until her hand bled, because that queen and that man needed 1,000 people fed 3 times a day for 19 days running, and somebody has to be that 1,000 people, every single time, in every single great house, whether the story ever remembers their names or not. Your granddaughter, who is young enough still to want the fireworks and not yet old enough to sit with the harder parts, asks you to tell about the colours again, and you do, because some nights that's the story she needs, and it isn't your place to decide otherwise. But you keep the splinter of wood in your hand while you talk, turning it slowly between your fingers the way you've done 10,000 times since that grey July dawn. And somewhere underneath the fireworks and the water pageant, in the part of the story you keep mostly for yourself, you remember the exact weight of a wet flour sack swinging at the base of a hungry flame, and the sound a beam makes when it cracks and, against every reasonable expectation, decides to hold. Centuries will pass after that fireside evening, more of them than you could ever picture, sitting there with your granddaughter's warm weight leaning into your side. The castle itself will not last the way the stone of it seems to promise it will. Within 100 years of the night the bakehouse nearly burned, Kenilworth's walls will be pulled down and gutted on purpose, not by fire but by soldiers in a war between a king and his own parliament, its defences slighted so thoroughly that it can never again shelter an army behind them. The mere itself drained away to bare mud within a few short years, the garden with its reigning fountain and its obelisks and its foreign birds gone back to weed and pasture, long before your own grandchildren have grandchildren of their own. The banqueting hall you scrubbed pastry flour out of at midnight will stand roofless within a few generations, its fine glass windows broken out and carried off, its walls left open to whatever weather chooses to visit them, season after season, for hundreds of years after the last person who remembered it whole has died and been buried and forgotten in turn. But something of those 19 days will outlast the stone anyway. The way the truest things about a place always do, men will write down what they saw that July, a gentleman named Laneham among them, scribbling an account of the floating island and the fireworks and the bear baiting that people will still be reading and arguing over centuries later, long after every name in your own kitchen has been lost from any record anyone kept. None of those accounts will mention Joan's scarred forearms, or Rafe's silent hands running careful over a scorched oven throat, or a 14-year-old girl grabbing a wet flour sack and swinging it at the base of a hungry flame, because there was nobody else close enough to do it first. That part of the story will only ever live in kitchens like yours, told by firesides like this one, passed from a grandmother's mouth into a granddaughter's memory, and from there into whoever she chooses to tell it to, one small unrecorded fire at a time, for as long as anybody in your line still remembers to ask for it. Some things don't change, whatever else the centuries carry off. The need for rest at the end of a long day doesn't change. The weight of a splinter of scorched wood held in an old woman's palm, warm from her own skin rather than from any fire, doesn't change. The particular comfort of a story told at the very end of an evening, with the hearth banked low and a child's head growing heavy against your shoulder, doesn't change either, not in 100 years, not in 500. So let it come, the way it always comes, the way it came for you on your very first night in that attic loft above the bakehouse, with your arm aching and your palm freshly blistered, and the ovens ticking on below you in the dark. Let the fire in the story finally burn all the way down. Let the questions about queens and earls and gardens that rainwater upwards settle, the way they always settle, into something smaller and quieter and closer to home. Let your granddaughter's breathing slow beside you, and the last of the coals go from orange to grey, and the splinter of wood grow still in your open hand. You have carried this rest a long way to reach it. Take it now, and let the rest of the telling wait for tomorrow. Good night.